Hello, welcome to the Booklovers Festival. I'm Leafa Singleton Norton from Yarra Plenty Regional Library, and I'm really pleased tonight to be bringing you an event with two wonderful authors who hopefully you can see at the moment, Kirsty Murray and David Hartley. Hi guys.
Hey Leafa.
Hi, Leafa.
Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we here in Yarra Plenty Regional Library are based on the lands of the Kulin Nation, the Barunggam people, and pay respects to their elders past and present. We also would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal communities that we broadcast out to today, which is a little bit further than usual when we're saying this at the start of a live event for book lovers. And I was just talking to Kirsty and Dave before we started about what a treat it is. As much as we miss our online, as much as we miss our in-person events, it's lovely to be able to go online. David's based in Queensland, so we've got a Queensland author that we can include who's worked with one of our local authors here, Kirsty Murray. So I'm really excited to be able to have both of you to talk about this really great book tonight.
Thank you.
We are here to discuss Strangers on Country, which you co-wrote. It's a beautiful cover, and I've just been told that, speaking of beautiful things, the artwork behind David right now is one of his creations, so apparently beauty going all around tonight, which is nice. Talking about Strangers on Country, I know you're keen to give us a bit of a reading, which I think would be a really nice way for us to kick off. But this is a book that was only just recently launched too. This is a brand new book, so congratulations on having it out in the world.
Thank you. It was just such a great experience working with Dave to put it together. So we have a little bit of a mutual fan club going here, which you may notice in the course of the session, because it's not often that you get to pair with somebody that you just have such a simpatico relationship with straight up in terms of the writing. So that's from my side, Dave.
Oh, stop it. No, absolutely agree. And Leafa, this, to be honest, has probably been the most challenging project in terms of writing that I've ever worked on. It certainly moved me outside my preferred style, and working with Kirsty has been a huge learning experience for me, and I mean that in every positive sense of the word. Kirsty really pushed me out of my comfort zone, and I think ultimately has improved my work as a writer and an author. And yeah, it's been one of those experiences that money can't buy. So Kirsty, thank you for being my mentor over the course of, was it 6 to 12 months? It was a huge process.
Longer. It was nearly 2 years from our initial conversation to when the book actually came out. It was about 2 years of from when the National Library of Australia actually commissioned us to write the book. But then there was many drafts and redrafts and revisiting and researching and conversations and Skype meetings and phone calls and emails that went on and on and on. So, and Dave rose to the challenge every time. But should we start with the reading, Dave? Because I thought, I think Leafa's right, that's quite a nice way to take off. And the little section that we're going to read from, but maybe is about James Davis, or Durham Boy, as he was known by the people who loved him. And maybe we better preface a little bit about Durham Boy and what happened to him before we read the little excerpt.
Well, how about, good idea. How about if you want to provide a bit of an explanation around James Davis / Durham Boy, I might even just start by acknowledging that this particular story comes from the Moreton Bay and Sunshine Coast region of southeast Queensland, and although I'd like to acknowledge the Cubby Cubby people, in which this story is really centred around, I also have to acknowledge that I'm not a Cubby Cubby person. All I'm simply trying to do is capture the perspective of one of the historical characters that came from within the historical recounts. My own personal background, I'm a Barunggam man, so my people and my traditional area is a place called Chinchilla, which is about 4 hours west of Brisbane here. So I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of the Cubby Cubby people, but certainly trying to capture the essence in which this chapter was created.
Okay, well, James Davis from the European point of view, was a convict, but he was taken in by the Kabi Kabi and treated as their son when he ran away from Moreton Bay. He was transported when he was only 16 and had a pretty horrific time. Started in Sydney, wound up in Moreton Bay, was horribly brutalized, and at 21, or just before he was 21, he escaped and wound up traveling north from Moreton Bay and spent the next 15 years living with the Kabi Kabi. So he was embraced by a wonderful man called Pambi Pambi. And so when we put this book together, what we did is we took the two perspectives, one from the European point of view of various characters, mostly young. We focused on really young characters who were shipwrecked across Queensland or escaped from the invidious circumstance and were taken in by Indigenous people across the north. So Durham Boy was taken in by, or James Davis was taken in by the Pambi Pambi, and Dave wrote, from the Kabi Kabi, and Dave wrote from the point of view of those people, and I wrote from the point of view of James Davis. So, Dave, do you want to start with reading about this? Is the final moments of the end of James Davis's time as Durham Boy with the Kabi Kabi people.
Sure. Gunshots, I screamed, but Durham Boy placed his hands on my shoulder. That's a message from them to me, explained my son. I must leave. Our people wouldn't let Durham Boy out of their sight. Even as the white men's boat travelled near the river, our people followed, walking along the bank. I tripped and stumbled over the mangroves, my eyes full of tears. Steadying myself, I stood and sang to Durham Boy. The rest of our people joined me in song, emerging from their hiding places behind trees and sitting atop of branches. The oars of the white men's boat finally stood still. They drifted on the flat water as Durham Boy took in every verse of my farewell. When our song was finished, I slumped at the base of the mangroves, exhausted. From the riverbank, I could see Durham Boy shaking with emotion. He stood in the boat and replied to me in song. I came to you when I was young, he sang, driven like a dog from the doors of the dead. I told you of all my misery and my torture, I said. Do to me as you think best, I am yours. And I dropped as one dead again, for I was hungry, thirsty, weak and worn, with looking behind me for the hated ones pursuing. You, Pambi Pambi, you knew me again. You could tell who I had been. My father, you took me and you fed me. You gave me water. You gave me meat. I was your son and I was glad. But the great commandment has sent for me, and I must go. I will come back. When the moon has come back to you 3 times, I shall be here. His words will haunt me forever.
Oh, that's beautiful, Dave. I love that scene. That's actually the speech that Durham Boy makes to his Indigenous father, Pambi Pambi, is actually verbatim from the original records that James Davis recorded, that he sang that to his father as they took him away. And so Dave and I looked at it from the two perspectives, and then I wrote it from James Davis's point of view. And this is what happened as he was taken away. No sooner had the oars of the boat dipped into the river than the bush became alive with my people. They peered from behind the mangroves, afraid of being shot, but their eyes spoke to me. Some climbed onto trees to wave or emerged from behind rocks. I saw them all, the children, the women, young and old, and my son reaching out to me. My father, Pambi Pambi, began to sing a song so sad that it brought tears to my eyes. The others joined in, the whole tribe singing to me across the water. They followed the boat along the river for miles, still singing. I began to shake in every limb, and a song rose up in me also, a song for my father who had loved me these past 14 years. That night, when the explorers camped, I shaved and dressed in white men's clothes. "You must be glad to have a shirt on your back at last," said one of my captors. Every inch of my skin itched from the touch of the fabric. I felt I was shrinking inside. I searched in my memory to find a reply in English. "If you had not taken me away," I said, "I never would have left them."
Nice.
So the conversations actually are based on verbatim quotes from the original records. So it was really exciting to look at these stories from both perspectives, to look at it from the point of view of the runaway convicts, the shipwrecked children, because we looked at 5 different stories about 6 different characters who were between the ages of 4 and 23 when they were either shipwrecked or taken in by these different communities from across Queensland.
Yeah.
Pretty exciting project.
I can already tell from the way you're talking about it that there was a huge amount of research that went into this, and a lot of, kind of documentation that you dove into. And you talked about the fact that the National Library of Australia commissioned you to write this book. I really want to dive into the research part, but I'm going to ask first how the book came about. So was it an idea that one or both of you had? Was it something that the National Library already had on their radar? How did this project kind of start?
Yeah, well, Kirsty, I was introduced to the concept through the National Library by them sending me the book Living with the Locals by by the authors John Maynard and
Victoria Haskins.
And that was fascinating. It was such a fascinating text to read. Obviously, as an educator myself, I'm always on the lookout for text to occupy school library spaces, making sure that whatever fills those spaces is historically accurate and culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive as well. We're having a discussion in the office today about a number of books that still sit on school libraries from the 70s, 80s and 90s, and basically how inappropriate some of the content within those texts actually is. But to get that book, Living with the Locals, it was just fascinating. I absolutely ate it up. And Kirsty, I don't know about you, but what struck me was just the way in which those local people, and I'm talking about those local clan groups up and down the East Coast, were portrayed as such giving and soulful and peace-loving people. It was beautifully captured, even though this wasn't fiction. This is completely based on fact, and how generous they were to those Europeans or settlers that had escaped the colonies or were shipwrecked on their beaches, how generous in spirit they actually were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved it. Well, I think I don't know which of us Susan Hall approached first. Susan Hall was a commissioning publisher at the National Library, and I'd worked with her before on a book called Topsy Turvy World, which was a little bit sorry, I'm just going to grab it back there. In concept, was a little bit like what we did with Living with the Locals. That was taken from a book called Upside Down World, which was a coffee table book for adults about the history of Europeans developing an understanding of Australian native fauna. And then when Susan read Living with the Locals, which was written by 2 very brilliant academics from Newcastle University, John Maynard and Victoria Haskins, they'd put the book together and they'd explored, I think there's about 17 different stories in here across 9 different chapters, looking at different communities that had taken in troubled Europeans, whether they were convicts or shipwrecked people. And so Susan sent Dave and I a copy of the book and said, what do you think? Do you think you guys could work together and do something with this and adapt it to turn it into a book that would work for children? Which was a pretty big ask, because the material is very dense and fascinating. But what we wanted to do was make it accessible to younger readers. So ideally 10-year-olds like your son, Leafa, so that kids could imaginatively enter the experiences. So we came up with this idea that we'd write historical fictions using all the material from this book. And then I spent about 6 months doing additional research as well to supplement what I understood from the book. And so then wrote a fictitious version of it, and then Dave wrote his version from the point of view of the Indigenous people, and we moved it around to try and make the stories marry and mesh, and then put together the facts section of the sort of facts that we thought would support the young readers' understanding of the stories, because stories are the way you really feel place and understand human experience. And I'm a great believer that nonfiction is really important to young readers, but they need the narrative to really enter the experience. You can't just give them the dates and the times and the places, and you need to make it visual. So that's what Dave and I were looking at when we put the story together.
Yeah, well, I mean, I must say I found it a great book, and you mentioned my 10-year-old. He's a big fan of this book. We're in lockdown still in Victoria at the moment, but it came out sort of closer to the start of lockdown, and we were doing a bit of homeschooling and looking at like trying to liven up what we were learning a bit. And this book, because especially of the format, I think, so as you say, you write one part, David, Kirsty, you write the other part, and then there are facts at the back of that. So you're saying I've drawn this, I've created a world, I've filled in what I know from the details, and I've imbued a person in this, which is, as you say, really great to connect with kids of that age. But then you also make sure that they understand what was factual about it. So it did take place in this place. It was these people who were involved. We know this because of historical records. And that blew my 10-year-old away, you know, being able to actually see a story that felt so real to him that, as you say, isn't just reeling off a list of dates. And it does seem quite unusual in that a lot of books that are adapted from research or historical books that have come before, or academic books that have come before, oftentimes when they're tried to adapt for a younger audience and you see a younger version of that book, it's really almost like that people have attempted just to simplify it, which in some ways that's great if you can simplify for a younger audience. But as you say, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to connect with younger people. And this book wholeheartedly does. It's such a beautiful story. To see evolve the similarities and the differences in the different places and people's experiences too. Was it hard to kind of select which ones you wanted to tell, or were there some characters that really felt alive for you when you started reading?
Yeah. Well, Dave was a bit bossy, really. You said you wanted to do Queensland stories because that's your country. And I know we briefly flirted with the idea of William Buckley because I'm from Melbourne, but that seemed to make sense. I mean, I really appreciated Dave's connection to place, and that would be a really important part of writing these stories. But maybe you remember it differently, Dave.
Listen, I'll come back to that in a sec, Kirsty. But Leaf, you talked about, you know, your son really gravitating to this book and getting caught up in the stories. As an author, and I think as if we have aspiring authors or people that are yet to be published watching this video, I think the one of the best pieces of advice I've been given actually came out of this process, and that was through Kirsty, because what we were doing, we're relying on these historical records to create these characters and get a sense of who they are. And although it may seem simple, Kirsty said, Dave, what you really need to do with the characters that you're writing for is find a physical attribute or a habit or something that we can pin on this person that makes them real, that makes them identifiable or connectable. And, I think, Kirsty, I think it might be the Correg Islanders and the Ghost Girl. You know, we put some little physical traits that a couple of the characters would do. You know, they'd get a little bit itchy when when they could sense, you know, a significant event happening, those types of things. So in the same sense that you would do it with any modern day character in a fictional setting, we try to apply those same rules of writing to these historical characters. And Kirsty, I have you to thank for probably making them even more realistic than what they could have been potentially. And then I guess the one story that I really liked writing, and it was actually a character that we had to make up. And Kirsty, that was the one of Warra in the Bindle and the Shipwreck Survivors. We actually didn't have an Indigenous character to pin So that actual story, and there's an image that haunts me within that story, and that's Warra, or was it James? It's actually James Jemmy Morrill.
Jemmy Morrill was the
Jemmy Morrill. Yeah, sorry. And the image that haunts me, Kirsty, is Jemmy Morrill when he's taken in by the Bindle, and he goes to investigate the settlers down the bottom of the hill, and he's sitting on top of that fence post alone, like a lone magpie, and it just always haunts me, that image. And I really thank you for agreeing to write that story with me, because I think it brought out one of the most haunting images in the book. Him sitting naked on this fence post alone, waiting for the white settlers to come out and communicate with him.
Yeah, this was Jemmy Morrill was a young sailor who was shipwrecked, and Warra, who was the character that Dave chose to write from the point of view of, befriended him and cared for him for many years before he rejoined European society. But he was also the inspiration for Jemmy Farrell in Remembering Babylon by David Malouf. So these stories are actually really deeply embedded in all sorts of aspects of Australian understanding of place. And I really love that story too, because I love Remembering Babylon as a book. I think it's a really interesting interpretation. It's very European in its interpretation, because we tend to only look at these stories through the European record. And what was great about doing this project and using Maynard and Haskins materials was starting to think, well, let's turn it around. And when we came to the title too, because it was going to be the junior version of Living with the Locals, we'd invested so much in entering the imaginative landscapes of these communities too, and thinking, well, what was it like to be the people who took the strangers in? Not the Europeans who went to live with them, but we really wanted to place it from the point of view of the custodians of the land, of the people who were being generous and opening their communities to these shipwrecked people. And the story that Dave mentioned about the Cororag Islanders, that's one of my favorite in the book. That's about a young girl called Barbara Thompson. And Barbara Thompson, when she was 12 years old in 1844, married a sailor, William Thompson. It was legal for 12-year-old girls to be married at that time. And he took her in a boat up to the Torres Strait and then rowed her into a storm, and he drowned. And she was rescued by a group of Cororag Islanders and a particularly noble character called Tomagugu, who Dave wrote from Tomagugu's point of view. And Tomagugu, she described him when she went back to Sydney. She said, he was my true brother. He was the best man in the islands. And it was really moving. And nobody remembers Barbara Thompson. They remember Eliza Fraser, who was shipwrecked for 6 weeks. Barbara Thompson pretty much grew up with the Cororag Islanders. She was there from when she was 14 by the time she was shipwrecked to when she was 19. And they adopted her as their daughter. So they're amazing stories that I think they're just so neglected in the telling. And you can find them in various adult historic fiction and non-fictions. But these are stories, I think, that really speak to kids about young people and their experiences of first contact and first friendships. And we neglect these stories for political reasons. I think we like to focus on the miserable stories rather than, I find these stories really moving and uplifting and exciting. And that the way in Indigenous history is often presented to kids doesn't make them feel addressed by it, just makes them feel disengaged. And it's such a shame, because it's the beautiful stories, and it's a really important part of being an Australian is to understand these stories. And thanks for all those nice things, Dave, too.
And on the flip side of that one, Kirsty, as well, I think young Indigenous readers find it really hard to relate to the historical recounts that they might find, or the representation of those Indigenous characters within some of those books, because they're not from a strength space. we wrote from a really strong strength-based perspective throughout these stories, Leafa. And what we certainly hope with our young Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander readers, flicking through these stories, that they can see a sense of self and their culture acknowledged and probably more importantly celebrated as well.
Absolutely. And to see this book so beautifully told with two voices that sit really beautifully in harmony, I think is such a great thing for young readers to engage with, both from a storytelling perspective, but also from the perspective of understanding history as it is, that there are, more versions of history than they maybe see when they're presented at school, which, is different now from when I grew up, I'm told, in the way that history is presented as a series of facts. But also it can be hard to find, as you say, something that really beautifully illustrates that. And this book really takes that space and runs with it. I just wanted to mention about beautiful illustration, Leafa. You just figured that
this book is so gorgeous thanks to Dov Leffler, who's a Western Australian Indigenous illustrator. And he's, remember the first time we saw some of the pictures, Dave? Yeah. It was like, this book is going to be so exciting because he's such a beautiful portrait artist. And he just imagined, there's very few photographic records of these particular characters, one or two. There are images for it, but Dove just brought everybody to life through illustration and made it so much more rich in the telling and in the writing of the books, in the way he imagined the various characters. So we're really lucky working with the National Library that they put such a good team together. And I'd also like to say, Dave is so smart. He said all these nice things about me, but as an educator and as a writer and as an Indigenous Australian, he blew my mind with the way he made the stories really alive. I mean, I've published 23 books. So for me, this was a great exercise in craft and in heart. But working with Dave made me think in different ways about how we tell stories and how you work collaboratively on a story and how we share history and who owns history. It opened up so many conversations. So I'm really proud to work with the National Library and with Dave and with Dove to put this book together, because we need more books like it.
Yeah.
Hey, Kirsty, when I was a kid, you get these readers from school, and they were largely, it was in black and white print, but, every 40 or so pages, you get that beautiful glossy colour illustration. And I always used to think, oh gosh, I'd love to write a book with coloured illustrations. And you're right, looking at Dove's work, it just brings those characters to life. And the way that the National Library have put the book together with those, with the large glossy pages, it's just such a beautiful looking book.
It's a whole book of glossy paged book. It's like a complete package.
The book of gloss.
Overachieving your dreams. I'd like a book with some glossy, nice pages in it. Well, yeah. Overshot that. That's pretty great. Dave, a lot of people will know your Deadly D series, in which I know you it was another collaboration and an experience where you worked with someone else. And Kirsty, I know you, I think of you predominantly as someone who shows amazing skill at bringing history to life. And I wonder, as you were just saying, Kirsty, you learned a lot from Dave and vice versa. Do you feel like a project like this does bring two different people and then takes a whole level of negotiation and skill to even just manage the people part of it? Or do you feel like you can bring those kinds of strengths together and make something that, has its own unique flavour that you wouldn't get if you didn't work with someone else?
Yeah, I don't think you'd get the flavour. I certainly wouldn't have had the confidence to write this book without Dave, because, as a European Australian, as a white Australian, wanting to be respectful, wanting to tell these stories, but not feeling confident to be able to own the voice, because these are such important stories. You do want to be really, really careful to tell them respectfully and appropriately. And so being paired with Dave just gave me the confidence to explore the material more deeply. I have actually worked a couple of times with Indigenous authors in the past to get permissions for including Indigenous material in books. And it's always been a really, really positive experience. And I think people are often nervous of it, as nervous of this sort of challenge. And the whole point of being a writer is to accept challenge, is to accept story and to immerse yourself in other people's experiences. So being able to work collaboratively with somebody is always a privilege. I do think, having done a couple of other collaborative projects in the past with different personalities, that Dave and I were really lucky because we instantly got on. And I think, every time we finished working on a piece, I was incredibly impressed by how energetic and imaginative and receptive he was to working with historical material when he hadn't worked with it before. A couple of times we had things where Dave's imagination was bigger than the material to hand. And I'd say, I don't think we can do this because we're running outside the boundaries of what is documented. So we were always really, really careful. When you work at the National Library, they're fantastic like that. You do have to work within really strict, narrow parameters of what is possible and what is truth. So, and Dave was so professional and so immediate about, yep, let's do that. And I know sometimes with other writers, you might be doing something like that and they go, oh no, well, why don't we just stretch it? Why don't we just throw in something fantastical that's not going to be really true? But with Dave, he was always so, right, okay, on it. And we really quickly went back and worked inside those guidelines. So.
Yeah. So by that stage, Leafa, Kirsty had published, close to 30 books. I think I had 3 published by that stage. So I was certainly in no position to be calling any shots. As I said earlier on, I saw it as a really good opportunity to learn. As my wife says to me quite often, feedback's a gift, but it truly is. but it truly is. So everything that Kirsty would suggest, obviously I'd need to take some time to think it through, and then trying to find a link or a certain section of the story that I could bring in a different direction or a different perspective was what I'd be looking for. The interesting thing with and without spoiler alert, but the interesting thing with the way that all of these stories end, I mean, ultimately they end in tragedy or sadness. They really do, and that's I think that was the sad part of writing this book is, whilst they were a celebration of humanity and culture, there was always an element of trauma or sadness, particularly within the last section of the story. So from an author's perspective, it was tricky to have some different endings, if you know what I mean. Because largely they centered around the white character leaving country, going back home to where they'd originated on a boat, and so you would really need to capture both characters' voices in the ending of those ending of those stories, because ultimately it was quite a sad ending. Kirsty, what do you reckon about that? I found that I remember I gave you. There was probably 2 or 3 endings in the first draft that were almost carbon copy.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing with history, though, history is full of darkness, and walking into the dark is always really, really difficult. I mean, I think when you're writing more playfully, you can put happy endings in, but there's particularly if you look at the invasion history of Australia, there's not a lot of happy endings there for anybody. And what you want to look for is the heart, and that's, I think, one thing that with the partings, and the great thing about working with these stories is a lot of the young Europeans didn't actually want to go back to European civilization. Some of them did. Durham boy James Davis definitely didn't. That reading we did, he didn't want to go back. Narcisse Palliater, who was a young French sailor who was shipwrecked, he believed he was being kidnapped when he was taken away. So I think it's really what you have to do when you're looking at the dark past is look at how people feel. So the endings are sad, but they're also kind of moving to me. They're about human connection, and I've written about the Irish potato famine and other really dark aspects of the past too. And I must admit, with Dirranboy, I actually, when I read about the Kilcoy poisonings, or about 60 people were poisoned when they were given flour laced with arsenic, and when we were working on that story, I thought, oh, I can't do this, because it's so traumatic, entering into that and thinking what it meant for those people, and what it meant for Pamby to lose members of his extended family, and what it meant to Dirranboy. And so, but looking into the dark is illuminating, and not every story has to be up, and it can, yeah. So
we have a theme for this year's Booklovers Festival, which is creativity and resilience, and these stories feature amazing resilience from most of the characters involved. All, in fact, I was going to say most. Hang on, no, I think we can say all. There's a huge amount of resilience at play there, and that grief that you talk about in there of the goodbyes is so present in those stories. But it's a really honouring way to talk about those things, I think, because there was, in a lot of cases, that assumption, as you were talking about from that reading, the idea that isn't it great to put a shirt on again, or isn't it great to have rejoined where you belong, but actually where we belong is up to us, not necessarily, you know, where we start, or where our stories take us. So I think it was beautiful to read those, and it did feel, as a reader, an incredibly honouring kind of way to pay testament to what the experiences of both the people who came and the people who accepted strangers into their families. And you know, I think that it was beautifully expressed too. It wasn't just that they were accepted into communities, often they were accepted into families, which is a really really lovely thing to see explored. When it comes to creativity and resilience, as I say, I do think that people should be having a look at Strangers on Country. I think it's a beautiful story, as much as it is for children, and it's definitely written in an accessible way. I actually think it's another great way for adults to be exploring the history of our country as well. Some of us are not great at getting into huge academic tomes, so, you know, some people might not dive in there and do a big giant book, but this one's really accessible. The stories are lovely short vignettes as well, so you can dive in and have a read and then, you know, pick it up. I'd also recommend it for family reading as well. It's a great thing to explore. In our house, it led to all kinds of discussions about the point of view of storytelling, about how many different histories there are, about the kinds of things we don't know from before recorded European history, but also the things that we're now starting to learn as we pay more attention to the Indigenous stories and the ways of retelling history as well. So I would highly encourage, if you're interested in creativity and resilience, if you're interested in storytelling about the lands that we live on, this book is definitely one to recommend to everyone. Thank you so much, Kirsty and David, for joining us today. Yarra Plenty Regional Library thanks you and our audience for tuning in for Booklovers. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks a lot.